I have to tell you, Julio, I'm a big fan of Holly Mitchell. But you got more RSVPs than we did for our Holly Mitchell panel. I kept thinking something was wrong. I was like, where's all the people? I think folks were right before the elections. I think people were just getting burnt out on election panels and, another session about propositions and measures. And so it was, in some ways, I thought it was a good sign. I was like, everybody's getting so many requests to hear about, the propositions and the voting and elections that they were just burnt out. They were done.
Well, you just made my day. Obviously, Holly Mitchell is one of my sheroes, so to even be mentioned in the same breath is a compliment. So I'm just going to say it's a slow day. Never did I think I could. Holly's amazing, so I'm sorry that I missed that conversation. But yeah, we're really excited to have her on board officially as a county board of supervisor.
Absolutely. I think, and based on the attention you're getting, I mean, you might consider running for office soon.
Yeah. I'll leave it to the super smart people.
Well, certainly this audience is excited. I think congratulations are in order, of course, for all of the hard work and advocacy that I think all of us did. I think that the folks who are interested in hearing about what's next, looking at our RSVP list, I know that it's a list of folks who are largely participating in whatever efforts they could to advocate, whether it was phone calling or just, spreading the word and, shooting out emails and answering residents, questions and making sure people knew where to go. I know that our Slate for Justice that we did work on with our now supervisor-elect Senator Holly Mitchell, we just did everything we could, and so did everyone else. So just a big congratulations for everyone who's on the line today, who I know did a lot of work in advocating. Because Measure J, in all honesty, when it comes to the propositions and the Slate for Justice, this was one of the singular wins, right, in a very long battle about dismantling systemic racism. And so with that, I want to introduce Julio Marcial for those of you who don't know him. Clearly you do, which is why we had such a big RSVP list. Julio has long been a champion. I don't want to just reduce his role, as a member of the Liberty Hill executive team, but just a long-standing advocate and champion and foot soldier in this battle in LA County. And, Julio, I just have to say, I, for one, am honored to be on this call with you and honored to have, been working with you over the last couple of years on all things, anti-racism and, and pro-youth and pro-communities of color and just, doing the good work. And so thank you for joining us today to have this conversation about what's next. And with that, I think, what we do know about Measure J is that there was clearly a lot of conversation, and even you go to the websites and you look at all of the news reports, this is directly linked to dismantling systemic racism, which, as we know, a lot of folks in this country would like to believe doesn't exist. Right? So here we are in LA County. We passed a measure that, says that racism and systemic racism does exist. And Measure J is a step in dismantling that, which is huge. A lot of organizations or counties around the country or municipalities around the country have started to pass, measures. Like Wisconsin was one of the first ones that said, hey, racism is a public health crisis, and we need to do something about it. But having the policies to back that up is a whole other thing, right? It's one thing to declare that something is a crisis or a problem. It's another thing to back it up with the actions and the policies that actually address that problem. So with that, I'd love for you, Julio, to talk a little bit about the history of how we got here for a minute. Because we know that some folks would say Measure R was the beginning of this, and that Measure J is what came next. So maybe you could talk a little bit with us about that.
Well, first and foremost, thank you, Michelle, and the team for having me in this conversation. It's always a privilege to be in space with you as well, Michelle. I've learned so much with you the last few years around that very issue, around number one, the good work that's taken place in the community, but ultimately, how do we support this? And so, I think Measure J, to your point, it has to be looked upon through a historical lens. Measure J was about people power, and not just people who were advocates or organizers, but actually a lot of folks that were inside county government, right? So if you were to look at what has been taking place over the course of 5 to 10 years, there has been radical transformation at the county level, significant systems change. And so, we want to also give credit to our county partners, our foundation partners, our donors who literally have come together to really understand that this moment is a commitment, right? So we often talk about what has taken place the last few months as a moment. What we're asking folks is, what's your commitment to justice? And I think this is another example from the county that they're committed to looking at this through a very holistic lens, but truly was people power oriented, but also the narrative power, right? That we were able to not only put Measure J on the ballot in less than 3.5 months, but to get 2.1 million people in LA County to vote yes, sends a message, not just the board of supervisors, but to our neighbors, that once and for all, this is the commitment that we're making. So as you mentioned, Michelle, there are folks that are saying that Measure R was really the beginning, but there's so much more to that. I mean, if you look at what the board and the county has done to really reimagine LA, right? As a county where we invest in our most vulnerable residents and provide care and services, not jail, when our residents experience challenges in their lives. I think you've seen that. We now have a new Office of Violence Prevention that is really looking at race equity, really looking at how structural racism has contributed to over policing and communities being exposed to violence at disproportionate rates. We have a new probation oversight commission, the nation's largest civilian oversight of a probation department anywhere in this country. We have the Alternatives to Incarceration initiative, which included hundreds of stakeholders from academia, from the county, from the community, really putting together a roadmap, a blueprint that is concrete, that's measurable, and that's actionable. We just saw last week that the county approved a new youth justice work group model, which will basically move the care of young people that come into the criminal legal system to a new agency to focus on youth development, right? We have the Women and Girls Initiative that has been led by many different folks on this call. We have the Office of Youth Diversion and Youth Development. We have the new LA Youth Commission. So all this to say is that, Measure J is part of that narrative. It's part of this narrative that LA no longer wants to be number one for all the wrong reasons. I'm born and raised in LA. I love LA. I grew up in a tough neighborhood in Pacoima in the Northeast San Fernando Valley. And unfortunately, sometimes it's often referred to as a county gang demonstration site or a LA city grid zone. And yet, if you look at the investments or lack thereof, that's contributed to that area of Los Angeles struggling, right? Looking at the SPA numbers and looking at young people and their development, factors, et cetera. So, Measure J was, J was meant for justice. And so I think, what J is going to do, it definitely doesn't level the playing field. I think part of what we have heard is that this is going to take from others, but what we're doing is refunding the community. We had a call recently with congressional member Karen Bass, founder of the Community Coalition, head of the Congressional Black Caucus, where she really talked about this is refunding the community, right? And so it doesn't level the playing field. It gives us an opportunity to really think in partnership with county stakeholders inside and outside on truly how to support our communities of color. And I think, as you mentioned, Michelle, and I'll end with this, one of the initiatives that I think hasn't really been talked about quite a bit as much as I would like it to be seen is the county's new anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion initiative, right? That paired with the Alternatives to Incarceration, both of them are seeking this really innovative and transformational change in the county service delivery. And really the goal is to reduce and ultimately eliminate, hopefully, longstanding racial disparities across all the things that we care about: education, housing, health, the criminal legal system. So I think recognizing that the county's budget should reflect these values and invest in these communities that we just talked about, the board took obviously a very historical step and adopted an ordinance, and what we now call Measure J, which obviously the voters have supported. So we are now officially in implementation phase of Measure J, and more than happy to kind of walk you through, but just kind of wanted to give that context, Michelle, when you talk about history, where Measure J lies in this historical transformation that's taking place in LA County, that it's really about how do we intersect all these issues and ensure that we're supporting communities and meeting them where they're at, and really calling out things that have been unfair, and really trying to ensure that we're moving in a direction that's around healing, that's around fairness, and I think Measure J does that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. I know that clearly the argument against Measure J involved the reality that 42% of the budget, county budget currently, is going into all the things that we don't want it to, so to speak, right? Into policing and incarcerating and, basically perpetuating systemic racism, unfortunately. And that's one of the number ones, right? That's what we're number one for, spending so much money on that. And that Measure J threatens those dollars and threatens the livelihood of those organizations or those institutions. With that, I'm not going to answer my own question. What has been the response to that? Because now we're here, right? The measure passed. So is the passing of this measure going to harm the existing institutions that are currently receiving 40% of the budget?
Let's not kid ourselves. I mean, that's been a big topic of conversation. So, this is the pot of money that is discretionary every single year that in the past, to your point, has backfilled the DA, the courts, the sheriff's department, and other law enforcement agencies across Los Angeles. Those folks will continue to get their annual budgets, right? So the LA Sheriff's Department is going to have a $3 billion budget unless this board sees otherwise. And so I think part of the critique of Measure J is that this was going to take away from their operations, which it does not. What Measure J specifically states is that on an annual basis, that the county, when we're talking about 10% of the county's locally generated unrestricted revenues in the general fund to address the disproportionate impact of racial injustice through community investment. That's what Measure J says, right? So if you really dig a little bit deeper into it, it basically means that Measure J and it's 10%. So if you think about a dollar bill, right, and you cut 10% of that, that's Measure J. And what it says is that it's explicit in its prohibition of the use of these revenues to support law enforcement or carceral systems, right? Measure J dictates that the annual allocation of these funds be directed to community investment and alternatives to incarceration. That's part of why I wanted to share the historical background of all the good work that's taken place over the last 5 to 10 years. Again, the ATI initiative, which again lays out hundreds of recommendations on a care first model on how to serve individuals that come into the criminal legal system in the community. But we know the community has never been resourced properly. And so if we're going to care for more young people, more individuals that have high needs, the community infrastructure needs to be invested in. And what Measure J is saying is it hasn't been done fairly. And so the goal of Measure J, the specific investment areas is to increase investment in jobs, housing, and wellness. I mean, I can go into the 5 categories, which will give you some kind of a snapshot of what it means. Some of them, again, are vague that need to be really discussed. And that's why I think the next phase of implementation for Measure J is putting together the 17-member advisory committee. And so we know right now the board of supervisors are appointing one from each office, and then the rest will be appointed by county department. And there's also 7 at-large seats available, 5 for the community and 2 for labor. But again, the areas investment are community-based youth development programs, job training and jobs to low-income residents, focusing on jobs that really support the implementation of the alternatives to incarceration work group recommendations, right? Especially, construction jobs for the expansion of affordable and supportive housing, restorative care villages, and really this whole decentralization system of care that we are talking about. Another area that Measure J will support is access to capital for small businesses, focus on Black-owned investments. And so that's a huge issue that obviously because of the pandemic, we know that small businesses, Black businesses, Native American businesses are being impacted by COVID. And so Measure J will hopefully be in a position to help some of these businesses down the road. Another area that obviously people are paying a lot of attention to is rent assistance, right? Housing vouchers, accompanying supportive services to those at risk of losing their housing or without stable housing. And then last, Measure J will allow for capital funding for transitional housing, affordable housing, supportive housing, and again, restorative care villages with priority for shovel-ready projects. So Measure J in itself, even though this is just 10%, you're talking about a multitude of areas that have been so underinvested in that Measure J in itself is not going to resolve that deficit that we often say, right? So again, the sheriff, probation, the courts will continue to get their budgets on an annual basis. I mean, obviously because of the pandemic, every agency are facing cuts. But again, Measure J is an opportunity to create, again, it's not going to level the playing field. I don't want to kid ourselves, right? It sounds like a lot, $300 to potentially $700 million. We're still trying to figure out what the final amounts are. Still does not compare to the billions that we spend on the back end in harming, incarcerating, policing communities of color.
No, thank you for that, Julio. I mean, when we talk about the numbers, right? I think many folks have seen the statistics that talk about how it will take a Black family 228 years or something like that. It might be higher to catch up to the median average income of a white family in the United States, right? So when we talk about leveling the playing field, of course, we are centuries away from that based on what we know today. And when we talk about the numbers, let's focus in on that for a minute and get into the weeds. So we know that at minimum, that 10% of the overall budget is supposed to be likely at minimum on average 500 million. Let's just use the low end of the average for that. So given that, it's projected that is going to start July 1st of this coming year, 2021. But that 10%, that first 10% is going to be used over the course of the first 3 years, right? So we're looking at right now, possibly the budget for this 17 person advisory committee. The budget that they're going to be advising on will likely be maybe 500 million. And that first 500 million is supposed to be spread out over 3 years before the county actually even gets to the point of every year that 10% getting dropped into this Measure J budget. Is that correct?
That is correct. So the board motion that the board approved basically states that the revenue allocation, as you just laid out, will be phased in over 3 years, beginning July 1, 2021, and will be fully phased in by June 30th of 2024. So again, this is why it's important to get the right folks on this committee to really think through what the next phase of Measure J implementation. But yes, at the beginning, it is a 3-year phase-in. And again, we're using 500 million, but because of the COVID pandemic, I've heard even numbers south of that. So we're actually, thinking maybe 300 million, given that the tax revenues for the county are significantly being hampered.
Yeah, and I think I remember early on one of the conversations that I had with yourself and at some point with Isaac as well was about the fact that there's always so much room for, I won't say error, but for backtracking, right? That the whole thing about policy and systems change is once we get the policy passed, because I think there's a lot of us who can point to a lot of policies we've had passed that had no teeth and really didn't get us very far, because that's the issue of systemic racism, is that it's been done very smartly. Right? Let's be really clear about the fact that systemic racism has been done very smartly, which is why it is so difficult to dismantle. And as you see, I've got my Kendi book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And what I love about Kendi's definitions is that he's so clear about the definition of anti-racism in all forms, whether it's queer anti-racism, space anti-racism, gender anti-racism, just all across the board, is that it has to be backed up by actions and ideas, right? That it's actions and ideas, so that the people that we're vesting with, which would partly be this advisory committee and our board of supervisors, to enforce, right, and maximize the full potential of this measure is going to be critical to its success. So with that, we know that there's a caveat in Measure J that says that the Board of Supervisors can declare a fiscal emergency and take the money back. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just want to add, I want to go back to what you said earlier, and I appreciate it because, again, I've been in philanthropy for now. This is my 22nd year, and we all love campaigns. We love, like, the advocacy. We love, like, getting the word out, informing, educating. And when we win, it's an amazing feeling. The weakest part of the work that I've been a part of for 22 years has always been the implementation. And I say this representing philanthropy, right? Love them, been amazing. But this is where I feel like the rubber meets the road. This is actually where you win. Implementation is everything, right? So I'll give you one example. The ATI, the Alternatives to Incarceration Work Group, which to me was probably one of the most impressive county authorized committees that I had seen in 2 decades, right? Hundreds of folks and different stakeholders, co-chairs that included, the Dr. John Sharon from mental health with Eunices Hernandez, like these unlikely allies who came together and put together a very impressive roadmap. And when it was all said and done, this was pre-pandemic. They voted to approve it, I think, in early March. The initial set aside, I think, was going to be, a couple $100 million. And yet when the budget came out, there was zero money allocated to the ATI, zero, nothing. And so the community is like, we did all this work. We gave you a blueprint. We gave you a model. And again, this is not to critique, and this is not to point fingers. The probation department, not even a second thought. They got their $900 million allocation, even though the number of kids in their custody had declined by a significant amount. And yet the ATI, again, allocated no money. And this is why I think it's important that all stakeholders, inside and out, really understand why implementation is so important. And so, I think for me, this is a perfect, obviously there's some politics as well, Michelle. I think, there were some skeptics that they felt Measure J would tie the hands of future, board of supervisors. And I think that was one of the caveats and one of the carve-outs that in this negotiation, because it is a negotiation, right? Even though the board, authorized for Measure J to move forward, there were things that they wanted, if there was a fiscal emergency, that the board had the authority to reallocate those funds. But I think that's where you have to monitor, right? You have to ensure that the will of the people, have to monitor what exactly we said we were going to do with Measure J. And I think I'm going to keep going back to the folks that we appoint to this committee will be responsible for ensuring that Measure J, the budget, again, these are recommendations informed by the community, have a focus on racial equity, and that the budget process is inclusive, that it's transparent, that it's data-driven, right, with ample opportunities for community participation. Because I think now more than ever, you have stakeholders who understand that a lot of these decisions around budgeting have always been made behind closed doors. And so what is the budgeting, organizing that folks are going to entail? And so I think, the clause to give the board the authority to reallocate during an emergency, I think that was something that was going to be a non-negotiable. They needed some flexibility. And, I think the community understands, but at the same time, there's still oversight that is going to be needed and required for that. What are you going to use that money for, if not for Measure J? So.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Julio. I think that's the part of the conversation I really wanted to get into now with all the folks we have on the line is, we are celebrating some real wins for racial justice, before the end of 2020, thank God, right? We were all holding our breath as it related to, full transparency removing, the current administration, he who shall not be named any longer, from power and electing different leadership. And so we were able to do that. And so that's inspiring, and I think puts a lot of, wind in our sails. Measure J was another win. But like you, I too am very concerned about the implementation piece. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask one of the questions that somebody's posted in the chat, which is, what can funders do to help with the implementation? If implementation is so key, as you've noted, what can funders do to help support it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's, recently I've been on a number of calls with foundations also who, before Measure J, when Measure J was a campaign, a lot of foundations just could not support it because that would require them taking a position. Very few of us who have the exemption from the IRS to be able to kind of, partake in this, we're taking the lead on it. But I think now that we're in the implementation phase, it means that any and every funder and donor can now support the implementation of Measure J. And so I think right off the bat, number one is the accountability part. And I think what someone said in the chat is absolutely correct. This is not just about numbers. This is around the qualitative data. This is about how you put this, this roadmap together, the transparency and the accountability. And to be quite frank, where we have seen success at the county level, whether it's around housing or even some of the COVID, approaches, is having, there are advocacy organizations and organizing groups that are holding the Board of Supervisors accountable, right? So the more folks are held accountable, the more their narrative is in the public, the more I think you're going to see people really participate in an authentic way. So number one, supporting the communications related to the implementation of Measure J. There's going to be a lot of meetings. These are the meetings that often, fall under the radar, but it requires community participation. So paying for stipends for people to participate. As a professional, when I go to these meetings, I get paid. Yet our community, our system impacted young people, our system impacted individuals who are asking to share their stories, we need to figure out how to compensate them, how to stipend them, how to provide transportation in case, obviously after the pandemic, when there are town halls or there are any types of engagement. So there's a number of things that funders can do. Number one, you can support the communications that we're going to have to keep this on the radar. We're going to have to keep this in the press. We're going to have to see, more editorials in the LA Times, making sure that the Board of Supervisors understand that this is a priority. 2.1 million people voted in favor of Measure J. But again, supporting the research. We're going to have to figure out how, to partner with a Cal State LA or a USC or a UCLA to create a clearinghouse of information. That the board itself did not allocate money at this point for the research and that type of data collection to monitor and memorialize the Measure J implementation plan. But again, there's a number of other things that we can share with you as well.
Thank you, Julio.
And fun organizing, right? So I think organizing was key to its success, and yet oftentimes we forget about the organizers and the implementation phase. So now you have an opportunity to support those organizing groups to really to monitor the implementation of Measure J.
Awesome, and I think I'm sure most of us would say, what does that job description look like? Right? And exactly what would we want them to be focused on, especially as that 17-person committee gets put into place. What is it that we're asking them to do in their representative roles? With that, a couple of questions. I think I'll give you a quick one, which is fiscal emergency defined somewhere, or is that at the discretion of the Board of Supervisors?
It's an area that will be discussed with this new advisory committee. So to your point, it was included in the initial, when the county council developed the actual language, but it wasn't defined with specifics. I think it was vague enough during, like the pandemic could actually qualify as a fiscal emergency, right? Tax revenue is declined by a certain percentage that may trigger the emergency clause. But this is where the advisory committee will have more, it will define that specifically more for people like us to understand when can it be activated.
Awesome. All Alrighty, and let's see. So another one is, how do we take a collectivist approach and avoid the various youth and community serving fields fighting each other to claim significant pieces of the Measure J pie? And in follow up to that, I'm just going to provide the context. Again, many of us have worked for decades, me and you included, Julio, on collaborations, on advocacy, only to find that we're eating our young. Right? That we're eating our young to survive as a nonprofit or as a coalition, and unfortunately get sort of co-opted by a hyper-competitive, capitalistic mindset that there's just not enough, and we gotta decapitate our competitors in this process. So I think Eric, who that was his question, said it nicely. But I'm being a lot more blunt. How do we enter this space of advocacy for these dollars and leave our self-interest at the door?
Yeah, and first of all, thank you so much for that question. It is an area that has been talked about quite frequently. And number one, I think here's where, here's an area that we haven't really talked about much with Measure J. One of the big bodies of work will be around contracting, right? So a lot of what we know historically, if you look at who's been funded over other, across different issues, whether it's around housing, education, you name it, it's been disproportionate, to a select number of organizations who can get through the contracting system. I've said it along, it's a broken system, it's unfair. Even just the requirements of having $1 million liability insurance, like if you can't even meet that requirement, you don't even get the foot in the door. So I think number one, absolutely, we're going to have to ensure that there is a plan in place, number one, to unlock the dollars, but to make it fair. And so, I think this is where, the motion that the board put forward that was voted on unanimously was very clear that they're looking at fairness, whether you're a small organization or a large organization, that Measure J is going to embark on really addressing the elephant in the room, which is a broken, some would say racist contracting system that has prevented a lot of Black-led, Brown-led, Native-led organizations from not accessing county dollars and actually walking away. We're a part of a small pilot where we've reintroduced public funding to about 100 new organizations who for decades said, I can't, I won't. It's harmful to our bottom line. And what we're trying to do is put the public back into the public tax dollar. And I think Measure J is a step forward. And now with new leadership, in a variety of different agencies, we have a new ATI director, we have Judge Espinoza, the head of the Office of Diversion and Reentry. Now folks are really talking about contracting in a way to level the play, again, at least provide some level of fairness. And I'm hoping that by having a transparent process where these organizations get to weigh in on what needs to be removed, what needs to be modified, that at least we'll start to make inroads to support, which we know is a very robust, capable community infrastructure that has been long divested, that the investments just haven't been there. And so again, it's going to be definitely a lot of lessons, and we're hoping that folks on this call and others can weigh in. And this is why I think, the subcommittee structure that will be put together once the 17-member committee, comes together, you're going to see a lot of different work groups, right? These 17 people are going to have to rely on hundreds of folks to really guide them through this process.
Got it. And so is there, has there been conversations, or will there be opportunity as you're talking about sort of the issues with contracting? We do know that we now have some precedents around private-public partnerships and the ability of our public entities to allocate resources to private foundations that are much quicker in their allocation of resources, right? And we've seen that happen between LA County and the California Community Foundation, as an example. Do you think that that is a possibility with Measure J dollars?
I do. I think you always have to understand the ecosystem of organizations. There's going to be very small, mid-sized organizations who they're not starting from the same starting line. And so I think in fairness, I think you're going to have to create multiple vehicles to get Measure J dollars out the door, right? So I think you're going to have to really modify and strengthen the master service agreements, which have been created to help organizations apply for these dollars. But you really have to have multiple vehicles to get money out in a transparent, fair, efficient way in order for this to work. We know there are a lot of small organizations who, if you don't actually address the broken, they're not going to be able to access these dollars. And so again, in full transparency, Liberty Hill is in partnership with California Community Foundation. We were brought together by the probation department, who on their own accord said, we are having a very difficult time spending a surplus of state money. We cannot get it out to certain parts of the county. We're having issues with small organizations in Lancaster, in Palmdale, in Pomona, in South LA, unincorporated South LA. And what we started off with a small pilot. It was about $3.5 million. And now is about 15 million. And so we've been working with that department at the same time to help to strengthen their contracting, but at the same time accelerate more dollars into the community. And so we've been able to get money out in 3 to 4 months versus what the typical it's about 12 to 15 months through the normal process. So I think, Michelle, to answer your question, it is one vehicle. It is not the panacea. I think it has to be part of a larger strategy on how to support a wide continuum of organizations who are doing different things at different times in different places.
Okay. So I think we're going to come back to the advisory committee now. We've had several questions about the committee and conversations on the chat around compensation, especially for volunteers who aren't coming from professional backgrounds, and don't have a high income and sort of the time to spare to what you've described as quite a large undertaking. So are these advisory roles, as an example, compensated or uncompensated, or is that going to be dependent on the position? Will the community members be compensated?
This is one of the areas where, again, this is why implementation is so important, and having, people monitor every detail, whether it's the board motion or the conversations. It's actually one of the things I'm actually quite disappointed in, because we actually had an example where I felt the community, the county, the board responded appropriately, and that was with the creation of the Probation Oversight Commission. Again, the nation's largest civilian oversight of a probation department. And what they did for that commission is that if you were appointed from the community, you would be provided a stipend. I believe it's a $5,000 stipend. From what I can see, and again, this is one of those things that just falls through the cracks. And I think because, for whatever reason, did not make it into the formal motion, I do not believe that there is a stipend for the 5 at-large appointments. And those are individuals who've been directly impacted themselves or have a family member who've been impacted by the criminal legal system. So whether or not we can add that back, I would recommend that we do so, because we actually have precedent with the Probation Oversight Commission, which is providing stipends, or whatever we want to call it, the technical term. But Probation Oversight Commission has that available for folks that are being appointed through the at-large process. So I think it's something that we have to take a look at. But again, this is why the monitoring of implementation is so important.
Excellent. I want to take a moment and thank the folks on the chat who have information and are answering questions. So appreciate that. If you're not looking at the chat, the question about the advisory board term appears to be 2 terms. So thank you. I'm going to say Armstead, because I can't see the first name. Armstead, for responding to those questions. Appreciate that. And I think the other question about the opportunity for stipends sounds like it's clearly still on the table, but that's going to be left to the discretion and advocacy of the 17-member committee once they are pulled together. So far, it looks like we have answered, I think, the lion's share of questions at this point. I would ask you, Julio, as we come back to this idea of implementation.
I was just going to say, we actually have the privilege of having I'm glad that she introduced herself, but this is Judge Songhai Armstead, who is the new county ATI executive director. So I've been sharing and saying ATI a lot because, again, this is all intersecting, all interconnected. So definitely, down the month, I would recommend you reach out to her and have a conversation because, again, this is the new executive director who's going to implement the ATI initiative.
Wonderful. Thank you, Judge Songhai. I appreciate that and appreciate having you on the call with us today. So Julio's have volunteered you for a future conversation. Look forward to that for sure. So I think coming back to this implementation piece, which is, I think, key for folks, right? And this 17, board, 17, person advisory committee. What is your hope, Julio, for this group? Like what would be your vision for their first 100 days? What do you think they need to get done?
That's a really good question. And again, I think I've seen so many committees been put together these last 3 to 5 years. And again, I look to the ATI as a great example of so much community stakeholder engagement, a lot of trust. When you're talking about money, I think we talk about the mistrust in the community, but this is also a sea change for the county, right? On how to really be authentic and how to really center those who've been directly impacted and really inviting them into their space. Oftentimes, when we talk about county board motions, there's this, how do I say it? And I say it with love because, I have so many friends who work in county government, but it's like, oh, this is our space, right? We know how this works. We know what the board is interested in doing, but really you're going to have to gain some trust from the very get-go, from the very beginning, because again, there's definitely a lot of eyes on this advisory committee, and there's going to be a lot of pressure to get it right. To your point earlier, this is a phased-in approach, but really being thoughtful that it has to be action-oriented, right? So we have a lot of blueprints, we have a lot of roadmaps that have been put together the last few years, but this group will be responsible for putting together something that is actionable, that is fair, that is inclusive, that is transparent. And so from the very beginning, really being clear on their end goal and then working backwards on how to figure out how to get there. So being, very results oriented, but at the same time, as I mentioned, being inclusive, transparent from the very get-go. And this is why I think selecting the right folks is essential. I know people are asking at this point. So again, the way it works is right now the Board of Supervisors, each of them is appointing one person. So if you are in their district and if you're interested or if you know someone, this is the time to reach out to that board office. I would recommend, reaching out to each of the Board of Supervisors has a justice deputy who is responsible for monitoring Measure J. I would send them an email letting them know that someone or you yourself are interested in an appointment. It's at their discretion, right, to appoint. And then additional members of the committee will be comprised of representatives from a variety of county departments. So a rep from the Office of Diversion and Reentry, a rep from the Department of Health Services, a rep from the Department of Mental Health, a rep from the Department of Public Health, and a number of other county agencies. And then again, 7 at-large appointments. 2 have to be from labor. So they want folks from labor that have experience working on housing, working on jobs, et cetera. And then the 5 are what I call the community at-large appointments. And so that is an application process. If you yourself were directly impacted, you're eligible. Or if you have a family member who's been impacted by this, by the criminal legal system, you too are eligible. And there's an application process. And Michelle, if we can get that sent out or put to the chat, the application deadline, honestly, is actually this week. It's December the 4th. And so all applications need to be submitted. And then thereafter, these applications will be vetted, people will be interviewed, and then the board will then ultimately decide who the at-large appointments are.
Sorry, the justices provided the link in the chat for the application process. Apparently, all of the board offices have already made their appointments, and the deadline is Friday for those who are interested in the other available seats. So thank you for putting that in the chat, and I would encourage our partners to please share it, you know, as far and wide as you can. I think having hopefully a huge list of applicants will be a good thing in this process. And I guess, when is the goal for this group to start meeting, Julio?
You know, sooner than later. And I think, you know, I think this is an important part of recognizing who will be on this committee. So what we know is every Wednesday, the board agenda comes out as a preview of what the board will vote on, you know, the following Tuesday. So I don't know if it'll be this Wednesday or the following Wednesday, but then that's when you'll start to see, there's a whole section under appointments so that you start to see who these folks are. We kind of have an idea of who some of those folks are, but you know, moving forward, they want to get everybody on board by the 8th of December. So there's again, this is happening really quick, but I think part of it is what we outlined before, that there is an immediate need to support the ATI work and all the other bodies of work that people have been lifting up, and how can Measure J be in a position to accelerate funding to support you know, these very ambitious, doable bodies of work.
Awesome. Well, I mean, we've had quite a robust conversation, Julio, and I've appreciated your just candidness in answering these questions. You guys should know he received no questions prior to this because we said we were just going to get on and have a conversation. I think that's what we've done today. I would, you know, leave any final remarks to you, Julio. I think we've done a great job actually of answering everyone's question. We've had the luxury of having the justice in the chat, really answering some of the more detailed questions. So thank you again for that. But I would ask you, you know, Julio, how would you like to close this out? What's our last call to action on staying on top of this as a community and as activists?
Well, you know, I think for me, this is very personal, and I'm going to get very personal right now. I had a significant loss last week. I lost my brother, who was, again, system impacted, had spent time in LA County Jail, and, you know, suffered significant mental health issues. And so for me, you know, when we talk about Measure J, we often talk about the theories and the blueprints and the roadmaps, but this is about people, right? And so I think part of our obligation, as we've said all along, is to those who have been impacted by this, you know, by these issues that we care deeply about around housing, around access to high quality mental health, to living in a safe community. And so, you know, I thank, you know, all the folks that are on this call, because you play such an important role and provide a safety net. And I'm hoping that in the next months, the next few years, that, you know, folks like my brother don't fall through the cracks. You know, I say this, you know, because I couldn't help him, and, you know, I could not find him a place when he needed it, right? When he was, you know, released and going back in and out. And for me, again, this is what I do every day. And this work is a privilege, but I also recognize that it does require all of us as stakeholders to once and for all lock arms together, because again, there's no one organization, no one foundation, no one county agency, no one county ED that's going to do this on their own. This is about collective power. And I think Measure J spoke to that volume where 2.1 million people said, we want something different, we want it now. And so, Michelle, thank you for this opportunity. And just stay engaged. I know there's a lot of things that are happening across the county on all issues that we care deeply about. But I ask that, you know, we stay engaged to Measure J, that we support those that are on the committee, we push them, and that we also push our board as well to ensure that we do the right thing once and for all. So thank you again, Michelle. Thank you for the messages of support in the chat. Thank you, Michelle and the team, for your support from an organizational perspective. But, you know, I'm excited, but there's a lot of work to be done, and it's time to roll up our sleeves.
Absolutely. And just thank you again, Julio, and thank you for being so personal and sharing, you know, about your loss and about your brother's journey. I think many of us, which is why this is so critical, many of us are impacted in our families, personally, by mental health issues, by poverty, by homelessness. And, you know, I think the truth is we know if our social contract isn't helping the least, you know, among us, the most vulnerable folks, then we're not doing our job.
Yeah.
Right? We're not doing our job. And that is why this matters. And that is why we all have to be vigilant about holding our board of supervisors accountable to making sure that Measure J truly starts to move the dial on dismantling systemic racism and builds on the tremendous wins that we have had around decarceration, right? Mm-hmm. And dismantling that system. And Julio, you absolutely have been credited with championing and drawing a bright line between you and many of those wins. So, you know, on behalf of all of us, thank you for continuing to play that role and to be such a consummate diplomat in it, because I'm going to tell you, I am not as nice as Julio. And he is always the diplomat and does such a great job of, you know, really working across the aisle on so many issues across sectors. And just, we appreciate you and we thank you. And, you know, all of us, I know, will continue to do our part to make sure that this work gets done. So thank you all for being with us today. Thank you again, Julio. And, you know, best of happy New Year's and holidays to everybody on the line.
Thank you.